Hello, everyone. Welcome to my YouTube channel, Prof. Jeffrey Sachs Fan World. And here is today's content. In the quiet heat of the Caribbean, where the sea glows blue but the politics burn red, a confrontation is slowly taking shape, one that tells us far more about the world's shifting order than about the weapons lining the shores. Venezuela, once one of Latin America's wealthiest nations, now stands at the crossroads of history. Its aging Soviet-era military, a relic of the Cold War, faces the shadow of the modern American arsenal stationed just beyond the horizon. The question is deceptively simple. Could Venezuela withstand a direct conflict with the United States? But the deeper question, the one that defines our era, is far more complex. What would such a conflict reveal about the world we have built since the Cold War ended? As I examine this moment, I am reminded that geopolitical power is never just about tanks or submarines. It is about narratives, alliances, legitimacy, and the strange moral theater in which nations stage their conflicts. In this theater, Venezuela appears outmatched militarily, but not necessarily defeated strategically. Washington commands overwhelming firepower, yet it also bears the weight of global expectations, the scars of 2 decades of intervention, and the growing rejection of U.S. dominance across the global South. Russia, sensing an opportunity to reassert itself, offers symbolic protection, a gesture heavy with history but limited in military value. China watches from a distance, calculating how American movements in the Caribbean echo across the Pacific, and Latin America itself stands divided. Some nations fear a destabilized Venezuela, others fear a reassertion of American power in the region after decades of striving for autonomy. Meanwhile, the Venezuelan people live between two realities: the hardship of a country in economic crisis and the pull of national sovereignty, a force that has shaped every independence movement in the hemisphere. Their military, though equipped with Soviet-era systems, is built for deterrence, for survival, for the kind of asymmetric resistance that no great power can easily extinguish. This is not just a story about war, it is a story about a world order in transition where old powers struggle to maintain authority and emerging coalitions challenge the narratives that once shaped global politics. It is a story about how a small nation standing on the edge of the Caribbean can force great powers to reconsider the cost, the purpose, and the morality of armed intervention. And so we must ask, if a confrontation ignites, will it be decided by missiles or by the political consequences the missiles unleash? To answer that, we must look deeper into the structures of power shaping Venezuela's precarious stand. When I look at the unfolding military dynamic between Venezuela and the United States in the Caribbean, I see not merely a clash of arsenals, but the confrontation of two profoundly different historical trajectories. I have spent much of my life studying how nations arm themselves not only with weapons, but with narratives, doctrines, and visions of their place in the world. And when I examine Venezuela's armed forces still bearing the structural imprint of Soviet doctrine, I am reminded that militaries do not begin as instruments of war. They begin as expressions of political identity. Venezuela's armed forces as they exist today are the product of decades of procurement, from Moscow tanks built for continental defense, artillery designed for land wars of attrition, air defense systems calibrated for deterring regional rivals, rather than countering the most powerful expeditionary military in human history. When I assess these forces, I cannot avoid the obvious truth: they were never intended to match the United States in open battle, nor to project power across seas. They were designed for something else entirely: to guard the regime, to deter internal and regional threats, and to survive long enough to make intervention costly. By contrast, the United States has built and continuously refined a military centered on global reach and instantaneous dominance. In the Caribbean basin, that power is magnified. I have visited naval bases, spoken with strategists, and observed how the U.S. fuses intelligence, naval capabilities, and air superiority into a seamless architecture of control. The geographical logic is simple. The Caribbean is an American sphere of influence, closely monitored, heavily patrolled, and deeply embedded in Washington's security doctrines. It is one of the few theaters where the U.S. enjoys near total operational supremacy, air-sea intelligence, and logistics. This asymmetry is not an accident. It is structural. Venezuela's military is a defensive shield. America's military is a global hammer. Yet the question, who is stronger, is not the question that matters. The deeper question is, what happens when a weaker state must confront a vastly stronger one? History is full of moments when the powerful underestimated the defensive tenacity, political cohesion, or asymmetric ingenuity of the weak. Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq are cautionary tales, not because the weaker side won in a conventional sense, but because they denied victory to stronger opponents at immense cost. Still, Venezuela is not Vietnam. It does not possess the mountains, the population, or the strategic depth to sustain conventional resistance. It carries the additional burden of economic collapse, sanctions, institutional erosion, and political fragmentation. A Soviet-style force without a Soviet-level industrial base is a fragile force. It must ration fuel, stretch spare parts, and improvise under pressure. So as I begin this analysis, I cannot pretend a playing field is level. It is not, but neither is the outcome predetermined. Militaries fight wars, but economics, politics, and legitimacy determine which wars can be won and which wars should never begin. When I shift my focus from Venezuela's internal military structure to the broader Caribbean theater, I encounter a geopolitical landscape shaped by a century of American consolidation. I have often argued that geography is the most unforgiving of strategic realities. Nowhere is this clearer than in the Caribbean basin, a region where Washington's strategic reflexes are nearly automatic, the product of doctrines stretching back to the Monroe era and later reinforced through the Cold War security architecture. The United States regards the Caribbean not merely as a neighborhood, but as a strategic extension of the American homeland. Everything from the placement of naval bases to the structure of surveillance networks reflects a single assumption: the Caribbean must remain stable, predictable, and above all, free from external military penetration. I have listened to American strategists describe the region as non-negotiable, a space where disruptions are treated as threats to national security, not as distant geopolitical irritants. In this environment, America's structural advantage over Venezuela is overwhelming. The U.S. Southern Command routinely coordinates air patrols, intelligence operations, naval deployments, and logistical support lines that operate with a level of speed and accuracy Venezuela simply cannot match. A U.S. carrier group can exert more firepower than the entire Venezuelan Air Force. American drones, satellites, and electronic warfare systems blanket the region with persistent visibility, and the U.S. Navy's dominance from destroyers to fast attack submarines makes it nearly impossible for Venezuela to maneuver unseen. I do not describe this to glorify American strength. In fact, I find it sobering, because overwhelming power often blinds nations to the complexities beneath the surface. But in purely operational terms, Venezuela faces a foe whose capacity is so expansive that any conventional confrontation would be short-lived. A Venezuelan frigate designed with Soviet hardware of the late Cold War cannot withstand a modern American missile barrage. Its Air Force, struggling with aging aircraft and limited maintenance capability, lacks the sortie rate required to counter American operations. Even Venezuela's ground forces, though sizable, are confined by geography and cannot shift the strategic balance in a maritime theater. But military capability is only one dimension of this story. The United States also wields political power in the region. Almost every Caribbean nation maintains deep economic, political, and security ties with Washington. Ports, airspace, logistical corridors, and intelligence sharing agreements all flow in America's favor. Venezuela is isolated, diplomatically weakened, and economically distressed. This means that in a crisis, Washington will not only dominate militarily, but will also control the operational environment politically and logistically. Some observers argue that Venezuela could use asymmetric tactics, shore-based missiles, guerrilla strategies, or even cyber operations to impose costs on a U.S. intervention. But these methods have limits. The geography of the Venezuelan coast does not provide the labyrinthine protection offered by the mountains of Afghanistan or the jungles of Vietnam. The state's oil infrastructure, already fragile, would make the country more vulnerable rather than resilient during conflict. And asymmetric tactics require a coherent command structure, a challenge for a Venezuelan military that has become increasingly politicized and factionalized. In short, the Caribbean theater is one of the few arenas in the world where American supremacy is not contested by any peer or near-peer power. China is thousands of miles away. Europe has no stake. Brazil avoids confrontation. And Russia, though symbolically supportive of Venezuela, does not possess the logistical infrastructure to project sustained power into the Americas. As I reflect on this imbalance, I am reminded of a lesson I've learned repeatedly in global affairs. Power asymmetry does not guarantee victory, but it does determine the range of possible outcomes. Venezuela is not doomed by its weakness, but it is constrained by it. And the United States is not invincible, but it is structurally advantaged in ways that make open confrontation, should it ever occur, a deeply one-sided affair. The Caribbean Sea, serene on the surface, has always been a theater of disproportionate power. For the United States, it is a backyard of vital national interest. For Venezuela, it is a frontier of vulnerability. And for Russia, it is an arena where symbolic resistance carries far more weight than material strength. In this triadic space, the question is not merely who has more firepower, the answer to that is obvious, but rather how political intent, deterrence, and strategic signaling shape outcomes in moments of escalating tension. To begin, one must understand the structural asymmetry. The United States fields the world's most capable naval and air forces, and in the Caribbean, it can project overwhelming dominance within hours. Carrier strike groups, long-range bombers from Florida, advanced ISR networks, and decades of established infrastructure allow Washington to operate with effortless superiority. Venezuela, by contrast, possesses a military deeply rooted in the legacy of Soviet procurement, aging Sukhoi fighters, antiquated surface-to-air systems, coastal defenses that are formidable in theory but inconsistent in practice, and a Navy struggling with maintenance and modernization. Yet, paradoxically, asymmetry does not mean inevitability. Large powers often underestimate the political and human cost of military action in regions where legitimacy is contested and where local resistance, however technologically inferior, can be politically decisive. For Washington, intervening in Venezuela is not merely a military question. It is a question of hemispheric perception, regional blowback, and the haunting memory of past interventions. The Caribbean, after all, has long been wary of American overreach. Thus, the more relevant question becomes, can Venezuela raise the cost of conflict high enough to make U.S. planners hesitate, the answer lies not in matching American strength, but in shaping deterrence through alliances, geography, and political messaging. Enter Russia not as a savior, but as a strategic multiplier. Moscow cannot deploy massive forces to Venezuela. The logistics alone makes such a commitment implausible, but it can provide three forms of critical support. First, asymmetric military technologies that complicate U.S. intervention, advanced radar, electronic warfare systems, coastal defense missiles, and drone swarms that increase uncertainty in any American operation. Second, political legitimacy, framing any conflict as an act of imperial intrusion into a sovereign Latin American state, thereby raising diplomatic costs for Washington. And third, economic stabilization, modest but symbolically potent assistance to prevent the total collapse of Venezuela's logistical and military capacity. Still, even this triad is not enough if Caracas remains internally fractured. A state's real defense begins with political cohesion, not weaponry. In essence, part 3 reveals a simple but profound truth. The stability of the Caribbean does not depend on the balance of arsenals, but on the balance of intentions. Power in this region is as much a narrative as it is a material force, and the side that controls the narrative may well control the crisis. If conflict were to erupt between the United States and Venezuela, Russia would find itself at a crossroads of strategy and symbolism. Moscow's choices would be constrained not by desire, but by geography, distance, and global priorities. Yet, even within these constraints, Russia possesses tools, subtle, indirect, and often underappreciated, that could meaningfully shift the balance of perception, if not the balance of hard power. To begin, one must recognize that Russia cannot fight a war for Venezuela. The logistical barriers are insurmountable. The Caribbean is not Syria. It is far deeper within America's sphere of rapid military dominance. Any large Russian deployment would be instantly observable, vulnerable, and politically escalatory in ways Moscow cannot afford. But to conclude that Russia is irrelevant would be a profound misunderstanding of modern geopolitics. Russia operates best not as a distant occupier, but as a strategic disruptor. 1. Arms transfers and asymmetric technologies. Russia's most effective contribution is the provision of systems designed to complicate U.S. operations, electronic warfare suites to degrade surveillance and communication, short and medium range air defenses that force American pilots to operate more cautiously, coastal defense missile systems capable of threatening U.S. vessels approaching Venezuelan waters, precision drones and loitering munitions that increase the operational cost of intervention, maintenance support to revive Venezuela's existing Soviet-era arsenal. These tools don't equalize power, but they can make intervention politically expensive, which in geopolitics is often enough. 2, intelligence sharing and strategic advisors. A small cadre of Russian military advisors, cyber specialists, and intelligence officers can significantly enhance Venezuela's ability to detect U.S. movements earlier, harden critical infrastructure, protect communications, manage airspace and naval approaches. This is the kind of assistance that reshaped the Syrian battlefield, but applied more subtly in the Western Hemisphere. 3, diplomatic shielding. Here, Russia's influence is not military, but narrative. Moscow can frame U.S. action as another chapter in Washington's history of hemispheric intervention, rally sympathetic states at the UN, align messaging with China to present an image of global opposition, turn a regional crisis into a global diplomatic burden for the United States. For an American administration already sensitive to global perception, such pressure matters. 4, economic lifelines. Even limited Russian oil purchases, technical assistance to PDVSA or currency swap arrangements could help Caracas maintain minimal economic stability, preventing internal collapse, the true Achilles heel of Venezuelan defense. 5, psychological signaling. Sometimes the mere appearance of Russian support aircraft landing in Caracas, naval visits, televised agreements, can elevate deterrence even without large-scale deployments. In geopolitics, perception often outruns reality. In essence, Russia's role would not be to win a war for Venezuela, but to raise the cost, slow the pace, and complicate the calculus of any U.S. action. Moscow cannot remake the balance of power in the Caribbean, but it can reshape the political landscape in which decisions are made. In the final analysis, the question is not merely whether Venezuela could withstand a U.S. military confrontation, but whether such a confrontation would conform to the deeper logic of 21st century geopolitics. A conflict in the Caribbean today would be less a contest of weapons than a contest of political will, international legitimacy, and economic resilience. And on each of these fronts, Venezuela faces profound challenges. 1, the hard reality military imbalance that cannot be ignored. If the conflict were reduced to pure kinetic force, the outcome is clear. The United States possesses Carrier strike group, 5th-generation aircraft, integrated missile systems, cyber capabilities, full-spectrum regional dominance, increase economic lifelines to Caracas. Even with Russian assistance, Caracas cannot close the structural gap. But war is not simply physics, it is psychology, politics, and consequence. 2, Venezuela's advantage, the political cost of American intervention. If Washington were to strike Venezuela, it would trigger outrage in Latin America, diplomatic backlash at the UN, a narrative of imperial return, unacceptable to the global South, potential disruption in global oil markets, political division within the United States itself. In this sense, Venezuela's survival does not depend on defeating the U.S. militarily, but on making intervention strategically irrational. This is where Caracas holds real leverage, the power to impose international and domestic costs disproportionate to any U.S. gain. 3, guerrilla geography and the logic of protracted conflict. The Venezuelan landscape, mountains, dense forests, swamps, is inhospitable to a rapid, clean intervention. A conflict could quickly devolve into urban resistance in Caracas. Asymmetric engagements in rural regions, involvement of militias with regional networks, a humanitarian crisis destabilizing northern South America. The United States knows what prolonged engagement looks like. America does not seek another forever conflict. 4, Russia and China, the quiet strategic multipliers. Neither Russia nor China would enter the war directly, but both could provide intelligence and political support, increase economic lifelines to Caracas, use the UN platform to constrain U.S. legitimacy, push the conflict into the realm of global narrative competition, frame American action as destabilizing the global South, use the UN platform to constrain U.S. legitimacy, increase economic lifelines to Caracas, use the UN platform to constrain U.S. legitimacy, regional diplomatic frameworks, economic reconstruction, push the conflict into the realm of global narrative competition, frame American action as destabilizing the global South, a shift away from isolation for the United States as well. Coercive dominance is a losing doctrine in a multipolar hemisphere. Latin America increasingly seeks autonomy, not patronage. Economic reconstruction, that is where the real contest lies, and that is where the future of the Caribbean will be decided.